Finland is the home of the Moomins. The Moomins are the peace-loving philosophical family of Moomin Papa, Moomin Mama, and their son Moomin Troll. Conceived in the 1940s as a series of children's books, the Moomins are now a global phenomenon, making their creator Tove Jansson one of the most successful children's authors of all time. And yet she remains eclipsed by the success of her work. She is known, if at all, for her supposed hermit-like existence on a remote island in the Gulf of Finland, and not for the lyrical adult fiction she wrote there, nor the career as a painter she pursued so ardently throughout her life. Like her work, Tove Jansson's own story has many other sides and transformations. From her birth in 1914 to her death in 2001, her life was as colourful, complex, and as stormy as her greatest creations.
Don't know why there's no sun up in the sky, stormy weather. Since my man and I ain't together, keeps raining all the time. Life is bare, gloom and misery everywhere. Stormy weather keeps raining all the time.
Well, she was quite small and very gracious.
Thin and little, like a ballet dancer. Even she was really old.
She had an amazing ability to acknowledge every person's presence and be interested.
She was very friendly, but she could also hold back when she didn't want to answer.
Inspired by her love of animals, nature, and the changing seasons, Tove Jansson charted the adventures of the tightly knit Moomin family and their eclectic collection of friends across a series of 8 books.
The Moomins live in Finland, somewhere where it's so cold in the winter they have to hibernate.
The Moomin family consists of Moomin Papa, with his top hat, with his love of sailing.
Moomin Troll is very eager, very curious, and he's very attached to his mother.
Moomin Mama has this big handbag, like Mrs. Thatcher, and the handbag's got everything in it. I mean, everything is in that handbag.
I think that this concept of family really is very crucial for the success of the books.
But it's not really just this 3 Moomin unit, because it's an extended family. We have Snufkin.
And he's the character that you want to be when you're a kid, I think. You want to be Snufkin. I definitely wanted to be Snufkin, and then woke up one day and found myself Moomin Papa.
Hemlands generally wear dresses, which is why they curtsy, not bow. They're generally obsessed with collecting things, whether it be stamps or plants or butterflies.
And then there's little Mai, who's this very ferocious little creature, very tiny, lives in the cutlery drawer.
And she's disgraceful, she has no respect for anything, and she'll kick and she'll be incredibly rude and say all those things you wish you could say yourself.
There are characters in those books who you kind of set your teeth on edge, the Filijonks and loud Hemulens and stuff, but you learn that they have their reasons. And you learn that they have their uses as well. That's even more important, really. I would say that if she had one big theme, it would be tolerance.
While the Moomins lived together in easy harmony, Tove Jansson's family dynamic was more complicated.
They were close as a family, yet they all were active separately, and they gave each other space to be themselves.
Tove Jansson and her two younger brothers, Per-Olof and Lars, grew up in a crowded artist's studio in the country's capital, Helsinki. The city provided an eclectic mix of architectural styles, cultures, and languages. Her own family were part of a minority of Swedish-speaking Finns who lived alongside the majority of Finnish speakers. Her father, Victor, worked as a sculptor in the classical tradition.
My father was a sculptor. His main theme for many years was the female form, and Tove was his favorite model. Father loved big storms, and he loved fires. If there was a fire somewhere in Helsinki and father saw smoke rolling above the ceilings, then he gathered his children and went fire hunting. Mommy Papa, of course, was father loving storms and adventures.
The family could not always rely on their father's commissions to put food on the table. To ensure a steady income, their mother, Signe Hammersten, otherwise known as Hum, worked as a graphic artist for hire.
Mother sat working at her table, Tove beside her, and Tove had pen and paper. And Tove looked at what mother was doing, and then she made her own drawing.
Tove Jansson showed artistic promise almost as soon as she could hold a pen.
Tove developed her drawing technique when she saw mother creating postage stamps with narrow black lines on white paper.
She has described that the safest place in the world is inside your mother's tummy. So there's sort of a little world of their own where no one else can come in.
Mother was the typical Moomin mama, staying at home and preparing a good meal for her family. Serene. At all times, nothing could shake her.
Not only were Victor Jansson's commissions unreliable, but also his moods, which his family attributed to trauma he'd suffered as a soldier during the Finnish Civil War of 1918. Tove Jansson would reflect on this in her writing decades later.
Dad became gloomier and gloomier until he finally stopped talking altogether. One morning, he didn't even go out fishing. He simply lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, with his lips clenched.
Father started drinking too much. Then he became unfaithful. Mother never showed anything. Tove naturally knew much more about the trouble between mother and father, and she sided with mother. She sublimated her own difficulties by transferring them to the Moomin figures. She was unable to show anger, but little Maj did. And Snufkin could just walk away from it, and Tove couldn't.
Like many Finns, the Janssons would leave their cramped city dwelling each summer and head for the open sea. The Nordic landscape in the Gulf of Finland, which Tove Jansson explored as a child, would later seep into her fiction, appearing as the lush valleys and unexplored coastlines of Moominland.
They liked it so much there that then they came back every summer, to the extent that now
everybody else in the family has also spent their summers in this same spot. It becomes a really important place, and it is a really important place for us. Still quite a long way, but it's obviously much easier than it used to be. Today what we do is we drive to a town about 50 kilometers to the east of Helsinki called Borgo, or Porvoo in Finnish.
Like the Jansson family, the people of Porvoo were traditionally Swedish-speaking Finns.
It used to be predominantly Swedish-speaking, but today there are hardly any cities in Finland that are Swedish-speaking anymore. And then from there you go on to a place called Tirmo. And when you get to Tirmo, there's a ferry, and you have to wait. And then the ferry ferries you over to a set of islands. They go by the name of Pellinge. The road continues over bridges, and eventually you get to Erisviken, where the Gustafssons live.
The Gustafssons rented their house to the Janssons most summers throughout Tove's childhood. The two families have remained friends for over 4 generations.
Hey, hey!
When the Jansson family started coming here, they had to make the whole journey from Helsinki to these islands by boat. Once at the Gustafssons' house, the Janssons would sleep together in one room throughout the summer.
Har ni något minnen av när de skulle ha flyttat hit, eller du kanske, Greta? Jag har förstått att de bakade in sitt hem där i stan och flyttade med sig allt pick och pack varje vår.
Jag kommer ihåg en stor låda, och där var det mycket saker i den, och sen var det både sängkläder och allt skulle man ha med när man kom då.
Ja, så rodde någon härifrån efter dem?
Jo, min svärfar var ofta då här och rodde efter dem dit.
Det måste ju ha varit en ganska stor manöver.
Det var det. Och det berodde mycket på vädret. Om det blåste mycket var det ju svårt att komma.
Det fordrades ju att det var vackert väder om man skulle komma.
Ja.
It was here that the young Tove, already an accomplished cartoonist, amused her little brothers by scribbling her first Moomin on the wall of the outside loo. It was not long before Moomin was out of the water closet and onto the pages of the Swedish language press. Tove's formidable talent for caricature had caught the eye of Garm, a satirical magazine which commissioned drawings from her before she had even left school. The early version of Moomin she drew in Garm was known as the Snork.
And this is the first picture where you can see the actual Snork. But it doesn't very much resemble the Moomin we know today, which is very round and soft and wonderful and kind. This is more like a nightmare Moomin. And the picture is depicting the person's nightmares when he is very drunk and coming home very late. And the joke in this picture is that the gentleman is saying, well, it must have been a very cold night because all the ground is frozen and he is stepping on glass on the way to his home.
Although Tove Jansson had been a recognized graphic artist from as young as 14, she knew that her passion lay with painting and fine art. In 1933, she enrolled in the fine art course at Helsinki's Athenaeum.
When Tove was born, the father said that he hopes their daughter would be an artist. And that was a very important thing for Tove for all her life.
Almost immediately, she would encounter the first barriers to her ambition.
She thought that the teaching and teachers were boring, and I think they were very old-fashioned and conservative. Very many men thought that women's place is in the kitchen. Really, they think so. They believed in that.
Tove Jansson would eventually abandon the formal training of art school. Instead, she continued her studies with a private tutor, the charismatic and respected painter Sam Vanni. Seeing something special in his pupil, Sam Vanni asked her to sit for a portrait.
She has a pen and a paper, and actually I'm sure that she is drawing his picture.
When it begins to get dark, Samuel gathers his brushes together, and with a joy that hurts, I look at his picture and tell myself, it couldn't be so beautiful if he didn't love me.
She's so eager. She's eager to see even more. She's not like a passive woman. Some saw in Tove the intelligent woman. Tove had very many men, so I think Sam wasn't the only one all the time.
While Tove Jansson's romantic life had found the light, dark clouds would form across her country, with great consequences for her family and friends. In the winter of 1939, the Soviet Union conducted a partially successful invasion of Finland, casting a shadow across the small country's future. As Finland contemplated how to expel the Soviets, Nazi Germany's war machine spread across Western Europe and into Scandinavia.
My father wanted me to enlist, and my mother cried. I'd never seen her cry so much. It was a difficult time for me. Should I obey father or obey mother? So I decided to wait.
Caught between these two expanding empires, Finland agreed to cooperate with the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union.
Stukas starten zum Angriff im Raum von Murmansk.
Within days of the Nazi-led assault, the Soviets had begun their bombing campaign of Finland. Still working for Garm, Tove Jansson began a series of illustrations which reflect the plight of her country.
There is the Angel of Peace, and here you can see the demolished earth with ruins and airplanes bombing. The message is very, very clear. Tove Jansson was very upset of the war, and she was feeling it very deeply. She wasn't a political person at all, but she sensed it in a human way. She didn't like the Germans, she didn't like the Soviet Union. She hated the war.
Finnische Truppen im Stoß auf Viipuri.
By now, Tove's brother Per-Olof had been drafted into the Finnish army.
The war affected my family deeply, and I've always thought that it affected my family more than it did me, because I was in the middle of it, and they could only guess and be afraid.
Tove Jansson attempted to capture this fear in a family portrait.
It's a picture of a family in trouble. It's also a picture of Finland. It's an extraordinary painting. She was working with it for several years, and it was very difficult for her to paint it. The picture you see Tove in the middle, dressed in black. It's like she's watching all over the family. And the father is on one side, and the mother is on the other side. Tove is some kind of dividing point in the picture. And then there's the two brothers, Per-Olof, who is in the war, and the little brother Lasse, who is not yet in the war.
War would also separate Tove from many of her friends, including the Jewish photographer Iva Kornikov, who fled Finland for America in 1941. Tove poured out her feelings to Iva in a series of illustrated letters. which revealed that far from being solely a visual artist, she also had a talent for writing.
It became a kind of diary.
Yes, a kind of diary to write these letters. There are several pages in them. It could be 7, 8, 9 pages.
Sometimes it feels as if something of the collected agony of the whole world has been weighing heavily in me like a lump and threatening to burst apart.
Everything is just very depressing, she thinks, during the war. There's no inspiration and lust even to work, which is for her a very, very sad thing.
In her letters to Eva, Tove indicates her growing resistance to a conventional family life.
It's a man's war. I can see what will happen to my work if I get married. I would become either a bad painter or a bad wife. And I don't want to give birth to children only for them to be killed in some future war.
You have a feeling that she's quite a feminist here, but it's her feminism, I would say.
She could see that she was an artist. She would never have had time for family and children.
Her art was more important than anything else. She was ready to live without the family.
As Tove Jansson came to the realization that she would never have a family of her own, she began to invent one. The Moomins would bring together her gifts as an artist with her fluency as a writer. Her fictional family and the magical landscape in which she painted them would draw on the bleak realities of the day. In the opening months of war, Tove Jansson had started writing her first novel for children, Moomin and the Great Flood, in which a torrential deluge surges through Moomin Valley, separating Moomintroll and Moomin Mama from Moomin Papa.
I think you could say that she wrote her first 2 books in the shadow of the war, because there are refugees, and for the Moomintroll, the family is splitting up.
Moomintroll is trying to find his father and a new home with his mother. There are very many dangerous things before they get to the happy ending.
That first book set the tone that this was a family with all these catastrophes happening to them, but through being who they were, they would make it, and the ending would be a good ending.
The book was followed by Comet in Moominland, in which the hero Moomin faces another catastrophe.
Look, whispered Sniff in terror. The sky was no longer blue, it was pale red. Perhaps it's the sunset, said Snufkin doubtfully. But Moomintroll looked very grave and said, no, this time it's the comet. It's on its way to Earth.
There's a flood in the first one, and then there's the comet in the second one. And she was truly fascinated by the comet. She returned to it several times as a symbol or as a metaphor for the fear of the bombs, the fear of the annihilation. And that's quite unique, I think, for a children's book.
By the end of 1944, another disaster had fallen on Finland. Following its armistice with the Soviets in September, the country had turned its attention to driving out the Nazis, who left a trail of devastation in their wake. Tove Jansson's response in satirical magazine Garn was immediate and direct.
She's very clearly showing that the Nazi symbol is drowning and people, very different persons here, they are anxious to get away from it so that they won't drown themselves. I think that this is much more brave than we could imagine today.
Another conflict, one between Tove and her father Victor, was coming to a head within the Jansson household. It was time for her to choose a home of her own. In 1944, she found one in the center of Helsinki.
It was an artist's studio, really. Some of the walls were broken, the windows were broken, but that didn't matter. It was her studio, and I think it was love at first sight. That she could work here, she could live here, and she could love here.
In her new studio, Tove celebrated the end of the war and welcomed in an exciting period of experimentation and self-discovery.
Kommer du ihåg att du skulle sett Tove dansa? No, jo. Jag kan svara.
Of course.
Of course. Tove danced all the time.
All the time in every hip. Man dansar hela natten och man dansar och man pratar och man grät och i något hörn grät någon och någon skrattade där och någon flörtade där och när vi sen gick hem 4-5 på morgonen så snubblade man i de där trapporna och så kom det ut människor där nere. Konstnärerfest.
Still heady with post-war optimism, Tove encountered a new lover who would change her life forever. Actress and aspiring theatre director Vivica Bandler. Tove fell passionately in love with her. Not only were same-sex relationships outlawed in Finland at that time, but Vivica was married.
Tove wanted to speak of her love. She was so happy. And Vivica said to her, we must be very, very careful. And she didn't want to speak of it as openly as Tove wanted.
The affair was intense but brief, and ended within weeks when Vivica went abroad to work.
She had had her love story, a love story with a woman. And she was very sad, very disappointed, and she tried to raise herself again.
Tove threw herself into a commission to paint 2 society scenes for a restaurant. The twin frescoes are now conserved in a public building in Helsinki.
I think that Tove has put everything in this one.
As with the Moomin books, Tove Jansson wove the recent events of her own life into one of the frescoes. The end of her affair with Vivica is there for all to see.
The name of the fresco is Autumn Party. The summer is over and the autumn is coming and she is not happy in that picture. It's a bad day.
She portrays herself alone, while Vivica dances with a different partner.
I know the whole of my painting is going through a process of change just now. Becoming stronger and more alive, and this is thanks to you. Lines and colours aren't enough if there's no expression and sap and intensity in them. Even if it's the intensity of despair.
If you take a good look, you found every time something new.
Beside Tove sits Moomintroll, by now her constant companion, along with her cigarettes.
I think Moomin is sitting at the table near Jansson, drinking champagne and smoking.
Tove also recorded her secret love for Vivica in her 3rd and most successful Moomin book, Finn Family Moomintroll.
In Finn Family Moomintroll, there are 2 creatures, Thingamy and Bob. And they're coming to Moomin Valley. They have their own language. No one else can understand it. And they're carrying a suitcase with a secret content. Eventually, it's revealed that it is a ruby, a red ruby, with a very, very fantastic light. Also, they are chased by the Groke. She's dark, symbolizing a sort of fear. The Groke wants to get hold of this content too, because she claims it's hers. So the ruby is a symbol of love. They had to hide their love away for the society. There you can see, I think, the story between Tove and Vivica and their secret love.
Tove's personal transformation was also reflected in the bigger themes of the book.
In Finn Family Moomintroll, the hobgoblin loses his hat. And the problem with the hobgoblin's hat, or the plus side, depending on your luck, is if something falls into the hat, it will become something else.
And Moomin unwittingly hides in the hobgoblin's hat and emerges completely changed. But he doesn't know that he's changed because he thinks he's Moomin. And all his playmates, the Snork Maiden, they don't recognise him. And he becomes very, very upset. And then Moomin Mama comes in and he says, "You recognise me, don't you? I'm Moomintroll." And she just goes, "Yeah, you're Moomintroll." She doesn't blink for a second. She knows it's her son. No matter how much he's changed, she knows it's her son. And it's just, even as a kid, it just found that really... And it just came out of not an emotional story. It was a funny story about hiding in a hobgoblin's hat. And then suddenly this sort of punch of love comes through and knocks you sideways.
The book reflects the acceptance by Tove's own family of her romances with women. But in the wider society of Finland, same-sex relationships would remain illegal until 1971. While the first two Moomin books went largely unnoticed, Finn Family Moomintroll became Tove Jansson's breakthrough. Its translation into English in 1950 inspired a London agent called Charles Sutton to come to Helsinki to meet the author. Their auspicious meeting would take place in suitably impressive surroundings.
The Hotel Camp was the most wonderful luxury hotel and luxury restaurant, the most famous hotel in Finland.
Charles Sutton offered Tove Jansson a lucrative deal to create a comic strip for a British daily newspaper. Tove was still a relatively poor artist, exchanging her paintings for heating fuel.
Tove was quite excited about learning this new thing, new art of making comics, but she was an artist, and at first, instead of speech balloons, she wanted to have the text beneath the panels. And they said, no, you have to follow those rules, of course.
Tove quickly adapted her skills to the comic strip form, while also making it her own.
Within a very short time, only by the third panel, Tove Jansson is already doing one of her big innovations, something that I'm not aware anybody else has done before in newspaper strips, which is to use different graphic elements of the story to divide the panels. Here's a wonderful example where Moomin is using a hose pipe, which creates the actual surround of the first panel, and then is trailered as a kind of flow through the strip to kind of guide the reader. Here, for example, it's a ghostly story, so one of the ghosties is actually a dividing form. And here, very cleverly, she uses a door opening as the panel border to allow the characters to rush through.
Sutton pulled off a deal with London's Evening News, who would carry the Moomin cartoon strip to over 1.5 million readers. In 1954, they launched a massive campaign to herald the arrival of Moomin.
They took quite a long time to build up anticipation for the strip, because this was a big, big thing. They put in teaser images, they put this very cryptic image.
You open the newspaper and you see a huge bottom with a tail. Of course you start to wonder, what on earth is this and what's going on? So I think the campaign was genius.
Moomin was a hit. 120 newspapers ran the strip worldwide, reaching 12 million readers. It brought an end to Tove's money worries and led to further requests for Moomin-related projects. One offer she did accept was to stage the Moomins in the theatre, an experience she would share in her next Moomin book.
In Moomin Summer Madness, there's a flood, and this strange vessel floats by, but they actually tie it up, they tether it up to the house. What a beautiful image, but they don't know what it is.
After a while, Moomin Papa pushed back his hat and looked sharply out over the sea. Something strange was on its way, carried by the inward current. It was quite clearly a kind of house. 2 golden faces were painted on its roof. One was crying, and the other one laughing at the Moomins.
I think she was quite fascinated by, these tricks and how you can transform yourself. And everyone gets up on the stage and they are someone else. That's a mix between people that are satisfied with being themselves and people that want to be someone else.
Tove Jansson's own identity was being transformed by the demands of countless public engagements, including appearances on television.
I don't think that she could possibly have envisaged becoming quite so famous. People asked her over and over again, forever, oh, please, can you draw me a Moomin? Can you do this?
She was now attracting over 2,000 fan letters a year.
She answered the letters all her life. She wanted to do it for herself, not having an assistant or secretary.
On top of this, her newspaper contract committed her to producing 6 strips a week for 7 years. This constant creation of new stories for Moomin was taking its toll, as well as eclipsing her ambitions in painting.
In her notes at this time, she's quite aggressive about her own creation.
I've poured out my feelings into Moomintroll, but he's changing. I no longer feel safe in my secret cave. It's trapping me inside.
And you can see that in the figure of the Moomintroll. He gets bigger and bigger, and it's really, really big. And it's like a metaphor for the artist that is hidden behind. She's hidden behind the Moomintroll. It's just a Moomintroll. It's not Tove Jansson anymore.
It all came at a very high price. She practically fell apart.
Her commitments to the newspapers and the public did more than threaten her spirits. By 1956, over 2 years had passed with no sign of a new book. It seemed Moomin's adventures beyond the comic strip were over.
This particular favourite of mine is from the first story, and it has Moomin saying, "I only want to live in peace and plant potatoes and dream." And knowing Moomin's character, that sums it up perfectly, I think. And it sums up also, I think, a longing in Tove Jansson for the simpler life, for not having to strive and try and be more and more successful and rich.
As her obligations wore away at her creativity, a new muse was about to enter her life. Following an introduction at a party, Tove was invited to listen to jazz records at the home of a fellow artist, Tuulikki Piettala.
Tuulikki lived a bit away from the studio, and it was a very cold winter. It was a lot of snow, and she walks all this way to Tuulikki, thinking of Tuulikki and the snow and what she's going to experience. And they play their records. And Tuulikki had a bottle of wine behind the curtain. And they talked about Paris, both of them. Well, they talked about everything you can talk about when you meet someone that you know that you're going to love.
Not only had Tove found a partner for life in Tuulikki Piettala, but that love would reignite Tove's interest in Moomin and inspire a new book.
When she began writing Moominland Midwinter, she was often sitting at Tuulikki's place. So that is really the book of Tuulikki, and Tuutikki, as she's called in the book, a new character.
In the character of Tuutikki, a sea-loving tomboy, Tove Jansson created a soulmate for Moomintroll, just as Tuulikki had become for Tove.
It's a book about how beautiful the winter can be and how philosophical the winter can be. You can say that Tuutikki, she's the philosopher of the winter. So she says, nothing is secure, and that's the point. You never know, and that is just the point with the winter. So Moomintroll in this book, he experiences a lot of new things, just as Tove did, I think, with Tuulikki.
In Moominland Midwinter, Moomintroll's habitual hibernation is disturbed, and for the first time he wakes during winter, revealing an unfamiliar version of a world he has only experienced in the warmer months.
The squirrel comes out too early when the snow's still on the ground, and he gets frozen, and there's a wonderful picture of him here with all four paws in the air, lying on his back, but looking strangely peaceful. And little Mai says he's quite dead in her sort of matter-of-fact way, and I think she's secretly rather pleased. And then there's this wonderful footnote at the bottom of the next page that says, in case the reader feels like having a cry, please take a quick look at page 126, author's note. So we whiz through to page 126, and sure enough, 2 more pictures of a rather nice little squirrel scampering around in the snow. So I think he made it.
By the time the book was published the following year, Tove and Tuulikki, or Tutti as she was known, were almost living together.
Tutti had her studio sort of around the corner in the other street, but they could get to each other through the attic. So Tove would be here in this studio working, and Tutti would be in her studio working, and then they would meet and have lunch.
Well, they could be together, but then they couldn't return home when they wanted to. And it was also very important because both of them were artists, and they could have their studio of their own. That was very important, I think. Work was the most important thing.
By 1960, Tove's talents as a writer and illustrator had brought her wealth and fame. And yet her true ambition, to be acknowledged as a fine artist, remained unfulfilled. Determined to change this, she turned down the opportunity to renew her comic strip contract. Its responsibility would pass to her youngest brother, Lars, a talented cartoonist in his own right.
After the cartoons, and she was full of energy, eager to paint. There was a big exhibition in Helsinki, and all the other artists were abstract artists, except Tove. Tove has her apples and citrons, and they had to put her work away from the big hall to a smaller room because it wouldn't suit the others. So it wasn't very easy, and I think it hurt her very much.
In search of solace, Tove returned to the peaceful little islands in the Gulf of Finland she had enjoyed as a child. Instead of renting the Gustafssons' house as her parents had done, Tove and Tutti began a project to build their own house on a tiny island that would be all their own. This house would be a haven, somewhere Tove and Tutti could work through the summer, out of the spotlight, living a simple life. A 30-minute boat ride from the Gustafssons' island towards the open sea took them to their chosen spot, the tiny, uninhabited island of Klövharu. After 2 years of challenges and setbacks to construction, the simple, charming house was completed. To reach it, Tove and Tutti often braved the elements, but for them it was worth it.
One of the greatest pleasures the girls, Tutti and Tove, had here was to actually watch the sea and the storms. This place changes character completely. You can watch the sea raging from all directions. When Tove and Tutti moved out here, they had a good view of any boat that was coming in, so they would see us coming. Most often Tove would, of course, run out of the house. You know, it was always a warm welcome. And often Tutti would say hello from there and be smoking cigarettes.
Har vi haft egen kokarsfamilj till skolan och fått maten direkt från skolan, men nu får vi den från Ebbo åldringshem och det är inte något gott när den är ruttkörd i.
Nej, det förstår jag. Then you'd go on a picnic and you'd be looking for beautiful stones or swimming and doing all sorts of things, so she was always ready for a small adventure. It was always nice to come here, actually.
In some way it was very hard because of the weather. They had to plan for the food, for everything, for weeks ahead. They didn't have electricity, they didn't have any toilets, they didn't have any of these things you are used to when you live in the city, for example.
Tove's island adventure helped her regain the freedom she longed for. While here in 1970, she began her next Moomin tale, Moomin Valley in November, which features a new character called Toft, whom she based on herself. When it begins, Toft arrives at the Moomin house, only to find the Moomins are not home. The book would send shockwaves through Moomin land and its readers.
All the people who are very dependent emotionally on the Moomins come to the Moomin house for comfort and for pancakes and good conversation, and they're not there.
There is this sense of autumn and winter and knowing that the end is coming, but all with the hope of the Moomins returning. They're coming back from somewhere by boat.
While writing the book, Tove faced a devastating personal loss. Hum, her mother, took ill and died in the midsummer of 1970. In the autumn, Tove resumed her work. Rather than return to her remote island, she stayed at the Gustafssons' house, where she found comfort and inspiration.
Tove skrev sent i november här uppe och så ut genom fönstret här. Det blir ju en lite kuslig tid, mörkt och på det sättet lite dyster. Och så kom hon ner sen varje dag och visade att jag skulle se på det och läsa igenom det.
Just before the sun went down, it threw a shaft of light through the clouds, cold and wintry yellow, making the whole world look very desolate. And then Toft saw the storm lantern Moomin Papa had hung up at the top of the mast. It threw a gentle, warm light and burnt steadily. The boat was a very long way away.
You don't really know if they are coming back to Moomin Valley. It's left to the reader to decide or to imagine if the Moomins are coming back or not.
Having lost her father Victor in 1958, and now Hum, her mother, the family of Tove's childhood was disappearing. Just as the Moomin house was now empty, the Jansson household would never be complete again.
It became some sort of turning point or an ending point. Now this is the end of the Moomins, also when Hum is gone.
It's an extraordinary melancholic book, and when later on one finds out what Tove herself was going through when she wrote it, that again puts another perspective on it.
I was devastated when the Moomins didn't turn up at the end. I thought, surely, because everyone in it was so sad.
And of course, as an adult reading that book, I know they never came again because Tove Jansson never wrote another Moomin book.
Ending the Moomin series only increased interest in its author. Still struggling with the loss of her mother.
And the business matters were never ending. It was the agreements and rights and translations and inquiries and demands of all kinds.
And because she had a bit of a hard time saying no herself, she needed somebody like Tuuti to actually, say no, she's not available.
To escape these relentless pressures, Tove turned once again to adventure. And in July 1971, she embarked on a trip around the world with Tuuti.
Tuuti and I are going to go round the world. Japan, then Hawaii and San Pedro, and Mexico, and by multifarious ways, including a paddle steamer, up through the States to New York.
On their travels, they always bought a lot of records abroad. And when they lived in New Orleans for some time, they went to jazz clubs every evening.
I haven't quite yet realized it's true. Tuuti's studying English 4 to 5 hours a day, and the map of the world is constantly open.
Whilst travel provided a welcome distraction, Tove's thoughts would return to her absent mother, Ham, eventually giving birth to a new book.
One of the ways to deal with her mother's death for Tove was to write that book.
The Summer Book would be a decisive move into adult fiction, and is now celebrated as a classic of Scandinavian literature. It is based on observations of Tove's 6-year-old niece, Sofia, and Sofia's grandmother, Ham, during one of the last summers of Ham's life.
Both the main characters, Sofia and grandmother, are in sort of points of crisis. Grandmother's ill and frail, and as Sofia asks her, I think in the first few pages, "Grandmother, when are you going to die?" And she says, "It's none of your business." But it's going to be soon, and that's what she knows. Sofia's mother has very recently died, and she's come to the island with her father, who's very absent.
Again, Tove drew on real life. 2 years before Ham's death, the Janssons suffered a terrible loss. Sofia's young mother had died suddenly. Her father, Lars, already taxed with his Moomin comic workload, would now have to cope as a single parent.
My father didn't discuss my mother's death. Not then, and not later. That was his way of handling it. I was an only child, and at the time, the only child on these islands. So while the adults were doing other things, my grandmother, she'd be left to spend time with me.
They do wonderful, strange and eccentric games and create Venice out of a marsh. And you find yourself thinking, yes, why not? If there's nothing else to do, you'd find yourself doing anything to pass the time.
Things like dressing up, those sort of things were you did things for fun.
It's as if her and her grandmother are both able to be completely honest. They have nothing to lose. They describe people as they really are rather than how someone else might politely describe them. There's a moment when grandmother's false teeth go missing and everyone starts searching for them.
It was an early, very warm morning in July, and it had rained during the night. The granite steamed, the moss, the crevices were drenched with moisture, and all the colours everywhere had deepened. Below the veranda, the vegetation in the morning shade was like a rainforest of lush, evil leaves and flowers, which she had to be careful not to break as she searched. She held one hand in front of her mouth and was constantly afraid of losing her balance. "What are you doing?" asked little Sofia. "Nothing," her grandmother answered. "That is to say," she added angrily, "I'm looking for my false teeth."
At the age of 58, Tove had transformed herself again. With the Moomin stories behind her, she became a respected writer of adult fiction, producing a substantial body of short stories and novels, praised for their acute and witty observations. Tove and Tuuti spent almost 30 summers on Klövharu, but by 1992 they were both in their 70s, and their island adventure was coming to an end.
Last summer, something unforgivable happened. I started to fear the sea. The giant waves no longer signified adventure, but fear. Fear and worry for the boat and all other boats that were sailing around in bad weather. We knew it was time to give the cottage away.
Once they'd left, they never wanted to come back. And they didn't even want to talk about it. It was the end, and that was it.
In the last decade of her life, Tove was diagnosed with cancer.
She had stopped smoking. She smoked all her life, and I still smoked. And then she said, oh, could I just taste a puff from your cigarette? And then she took it out. Said, no, it's not good. Not good at all. She wanted to be like it was before, but she was tired. But she was still Tove.
I remember once when I said goodbye to Tuti and Tove. They stood close together in Tuti's hall. And maybe that was the last time. And they just looked so, a close couple.
Tove died on a summer's day in 2001, aged 87. Only death had parted her from Tuti, who buried Tove with her parents Victor and Ham, and her youngest brother Lars, who had died the previous summer. Tuti followed 8 years later.
It's different coming now that Tove and Tuti are not living here, because it's not the same without them. Because when they were living here, it was full of life.
Across 8 decades, Tove Jansson lived life to the full. Pioneering, gifted and courageous, she always made time for fun and laughter.
It must have been moonglow that led me straight to you.
Her legacy is still growing today, bringing joy to new generations of adults and children.
Through the Moomin, she is writing absolutely from the heart. She connected so easily with me across all those demographics and those oceans and those gaps of time, because she put so much of herself into those stories. They're so honest, they're so vulnerable, there's nothing calculated about them. And that's always universal. If you're really, really personal, if you're really, really particular to what's hurting you or what's making you happy, then you become universal.
Then Toft began thinking of himself. His dream about meeting the family again had become so enormous that it made him feel tired. The whole of Moomin Valley had somehow become unreal. The house, the garden and the river were nothing but a play of shadows on the screen, and Toft no longer knew what was real and what was only in his imagination.
Continuing our celebration of children's literature, a wonderful film adaptation of Charles Kingsley's The Water Babies here tomorrow at 7 o'clock. Tonight on BBC4, a chilling account of catastrophic decline in bird colonies. Last seabird summer, next.